quill is already in my hand. I can feel the weight of it, heavier than any sword I have ever lifted, heavier than the crown I wore at 17 when they placed it on my head and told me the kingdom was now my burden to carry. I have carried it. I have never complained of the weight. But this, the parchment lies flat before me. 8 men stand witness. Not one of them looks at my face. The document has a name. They call it the Decree of Erasure. In the dry language of Aurevallian constitutional law, it is a procedural instrument, a mechanism for the preservation of dynastic purity. In the language that no law book has ever been honest enough to use, it is a blade. And I am being asked by the very institution I was born to serve, to drive it through the one person in this principality who ever looked at me and saw a man rather than a monarch. She has already left the library. She did not look back. I told myself, in the cold hours between midnight and this morning, that I could do this. That love, true love, understands the architecture of sacrifice. That to protect her, even by destroying what we were, is still an act of devotion. My hand will not stop shaking. The tear falls before I intend it. It lands on the parchment, spreading the ink of my own name in a thin, dark bloom. The witnesses look away. The Lord Chancellor says nothing. I finish the signature. I press the seal. And in the space of one breath, the woman I have loved since I was 7 years old ceases, under the law of this land, to have ever existed. They will call me the Cold King. They will never know that I am cold because I used every last measure of warmth I possessed to keep her out of a prison she did not deserve. And the only currency the law accepted was her name. This story is entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or deceased, or to real places, is purely coincidental. It is a narrative built from the fabric of history, its laws, its courts, its unspoken cruelties. But the characters and kingdom of Aurevalle exist only in the pages of this telling. Before we go further, tell us in the comments where you are watching from today. This story has found its way to screens across the world, and we would love to know where you are. If this is your first time here, subscribe now. Every story on this channel is built on one belief: that the most powerful human experiences are the ones history almost forgot to record. Subscribe if you believe in the power of persistence. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you narratives like this one. And as we begin, consider this. If the law demanded that you destroy the person you loved most in order to save them, would sacrifice still feel like the right word? Hold that question. By the end of this story, your answer may have changed. The year was 1691. The kingdom of Aurevalle was not a large principality. Nestled along the sweeping bends of the Loire, it occupied a territory modest enough to cross in 3 days on horseback, yet significant enough that the great powers of Europe had spent 2 centuries attempting to absorb it through marriage, treaty, and on 2 occasions force. It had survived all of them, not through military superiority. Aurevalle had never fielded an army that could rival the regiments of France or the Holy Roman Empire, but through something far more durable: institutional memory. The royal house of Vauclaire governed not by the personality of its monarchs, but by the weight of its laws. Laws older than living memory. Laws written not in the heat of political crisis, but in the cold, deliberate certainty of men who believed that a dynasty, to survive, must be harder than the men who served it. Chief among these was the Decree of the Silver Lineage, enacted in the year 891 by the first Aurevallian sovereign, King Theodoric the Elder. The decree was in its original form a marriage statute. It required, without exception or appeal, that every reigning monarch of Aurevalle take a consort whose noble lineage could be traced, without interruption, through a minimum of 4 verified generations of titled peerage. Not 3. Not 3.5. 4. The reasoning was not sentimental. It was architectural. The founders of Aurevalle had watched neighboring kingdoms collapse under the weight of disputed succession, bastard claims, morganatic marriages, the slow rot of a bloodline diluted by one generation of poor political judgment. The decree was their answer, a lock on the door of the dynasty itself. For 800 years it held. No reigning monarch of Vauclaire had ever successfully challenged it. Two had tried. Both had died before their petitions reached the papal court. Whether this was coincidence or institutional efficiency, the Annals de Vauclaire did not record. But the decree of the Silver Lineage, formidable as it was not the law that would destroy Alaric. That distinction belonged to its amendment. In 1243, following a succession crisis that brought Aurevalle within a single vote of dissolution, the High Council of Vauclaire appended a clause to the original decree that transformed it from a marriage regulation into something considerably more savage. The amendment addressed a scenario that Theodoric the Elder had apparently not anticipated. Not the marriage itself, but the attachment that precedes it. The unlawful bond. The private devotion that, left unaddressed, could fracture a dynasty as surely as an illegitimate heir. The amendment's solution was the Decree of Erasure. Should a reigning monarch be found to have formed an unlawful attachment, defined as any romantic correspondence, clandestine arrangement, or sustained personal bond deemed incompatible with a legitimate dynastic union, the object of that attachment would not simply be removed from court. She would be removed from the record of the principality entirely. Her name struck from every civic document, every church register, every title deed bearing her family's mark. Her family's patents of nobility, however ancient, however honestly earned, revoked without appeal and without compensation. Every portrait turned, every letter burned, every servant who had known her relocated to a distant province and bound by sworn oath never to speak of what they had witnessed. And any person, noble, common, clergy, or servant, found to have spoken her name within the borders of Aurevalle after the signing of the erasure order faced immediate imprisonment. Not a fine, not exile, imprisonment. The crown did not simply end relationships. The crown unmade people. Erasure was real. In 1533, Henry VIII of England had his marriage to Catherine of Aragon legally annulled and her title stripped. Her name was removed from official prayers. Servants were forbidden to serve her. History did not invent erasure. History perfected it. The High Council of Vauclaire simply took a monarch's tool of personal vengeance and turned it into law. It is worth understanding, at this point, precisely how this mechanism functioned within the broader framework of 17th-century European court governance, because what the Duke of Marac would later do was not an act of personal malice. It was, in the constitutional language of the age, a legal duty. Across the courts of Europe, from Versailles to Vienna, the preservation of dynastic purity was considered an institutional obligation that superseded personal loyalty, personal sympathy, and in many documented cases, personal conscience. The role of a Lord Chancellor was not to serve the man wearing the crown. It was to serve the crown itself, as an institution, as a continuity, as a structure that was expected to outlast every individual it contained. This is what made the Decree of Erasure so perfectly, so terribly efficient. It did not require a villain. It only required a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Her name was Amélie Voss de Chantrel. She was the youngest daughter of the Vicomte de Chantrel, a man of genuine intellectual distinction and thoroughly modest means. The Vicomte was the sort of nobleman that the court of Vauclaire tolerated with mild condescension. Educated enough to be useful, impoverished enough to be unthreatening, titled just recently enough to fall precisely one generation short of the decree's requirement. His patent of nobility was 40 years old. The decree required 160. One generation. The margin between a woman who could stand beside a king and a woman who, by the cold arithmetic of dynastic law, did not exist in any space that mattered. The Vicomte did not know, when he accepted the position of royal literary tutor to the Crown Prince of Aurevalle, that he was also delivering his daughter into the orbit of the one person in the principality whose love for her the law would one day choose to weaponize. They were 7 years old when they first met between the shelves of the royal library. It was, by every outward measure, an unremarkable beginning. The Crown Prince was a serious child. Not cold, not then, but careful in the manner of children who have been observed since birth and have learned to manage what they reveal. Amélie was his precise opposite in temperament. Direct, curious, unhurried in her speech in a way that the court found faintly impertinent and the prince found, from the first afternoon, extraordinary. She had ink on her right forefinger. She always would. For the first years, their connection was entirely natural. The easy companionship of two children who shared lessons, shared books, shared the particular bond that forms between people who discover early that they think in the same direction. There was nothing to conceal because there was nothing yet that required concealment. They were children in a library. The court did not watch children. Adolescence changed the temperature without changing the substance. What had been companionship became something the Aurevallian court had no polite vocabulary for. Not courtship, which implied eligibility, and Amélie was not eligible. Not friendship, which implied equality, and a crown prince had no equals. It existed, as so many true things do, in the space between the categories the world had prepared. By the time Alaric was 20 and Amélie 19, they had constructed, with extraordinary patience and precision, an entire private world inside the margins of propriety. It spoke in folded letters, pressed into the spines of books returned to the royal library at agreed hours. Never signed, never explicit, always in the literary language of two people who had spent their formative years inside the same pages and had developed, between them, a private shorthand that only they could read. It spoke in the particular route Amélie took through the midnight gardens on feast evenings, when the court was occupied with burgundy and music, and a certain path behind the yew hedge was quietly, reliably, occupied by a prince with no official reason to be standing in the dark. And it spoke in a blue silk ribbon, a childhood wager, pressed into her hand in a darkened corridor one winter afternoon, that disappeared into her sleeve and never came back. They were never reckless. They understood, with the instinct of people who have always been watched, that recklessness would cost Amélie everything and cost Alaric considerably less, and that this asymmetry was itself a kind of injustice they were both unwilling to enact. So they were careful, they were patient, they were, to the court of Vauclaire, entirely invisible. They were not invisible. The court of Vauclaire had been producing institutional loyalists for 800 years. Among the most thorough of these was Sebastian Halid, the Duke of Marac, Lord Chancellor of Aurevalle, a man who had served 2 kings and intended to serve a third with the same unwavering fidelity he had given the previous 2. He had been watching the library route and the midnight garden path for 3 years before he said a single word to anyone. He was not watching out of cruelty. He was watching out of duty. And when he finally moved, he moved with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of a man who had never once confused his personal feelings with his professional obligations. The High Council of Vauclaire convened on the 14th of November, 1691, in the formal chamber on the east wing of the chateau. Dark oak paneling, 8 chairs, 8 men in their robes of office, and a leather document folio that Sebastian Halid placed at the center of the table with the calm deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment in private for longer than anyone in the room realized. He did not open with a speech. He did not offer a preamble. He opened the folio. 14 letters, retrieved, with painstaking patience, from the spines of books returned to the Royal Library over a period of 31 months. Each one carefully unfolded, catalogued, dated by cross-reference with the library's borrowing register. Not one of them bore a signature. Not one of them required one. The literary shorthand was, to anyone who had observed both parties in the same room for more than an afternoon, unmistakably intimate. A sworn witness account from a groundskeeper, a man of 40 years in royal service, since relocated to a property in the Salogne. detailing 11 separate occasions on which a young woman matching Amélie's description had taken the path behind the yew hedge at hours consistent with the feast calendar. On 9 of those 11 occasions, the groundskeeper had observed a second figure already present, and a letter, not a hidden one, not a library spine retrieval, but a personal correspondence between Amélie's lady's companion and a cousin residing in Orleans, intercepted legally under the Lord Chancellor's authority to review communications leaving the chateau's household. 3 lines in the middle of an otherwise unremarkable domestic letter. 3 lines that referenced, with the warm carelessness of a woman writing to family she trusted completely, the nature of the king's particular regard for her mistress. 3 lines were sufficient. The council read everything in silence. When Halid closed the folio, the room did not erupt into recrimination or procedural debate. It went very, very still. The particular stillness of men who have just been handed a crisis they had spent years hoping would not arrive, and who now understand that hope was always insufficient preparation. Alaric was summoned. He stood before the council. Stood, not sat, because in the formal protocol of the Vauclaire court, a monarch seated before his own council was governing. A monarch standing before them was under examination. The distinction was architectural, deliberate, and on this particular morning precise. His hands he kept clasped behind his back. His face he kept entirely composed. He had been performing composure since the age of 4. He was exceptionally accomplished at it. The Lord Chancellor presented the choice in the same measured, institutional tone he brought to every constitutional matter. There was no cruelty in his delivery. There was no satisfaction. There was only the voice of a system that had been designed, over 800 years, to be exactly this impersonal. The king could decline to sign the Decree of Erasure. In that case, Amélie Voss de Chantrel, as the confirmed subject of an unlawful royal attachment, would be charged under the treason of lineage statute. The sentence, fixed and non-negotiable under Aurevallian constitutional law, was permanent imprisonment in the fortress of Mont-Severin, a structure that occupied a bluff above the Loire, visible from the upper windows of the chateau on clear mornings, and that had, in 300 years of operation, never released a prisoner by any means other than death. Or the king could sign, and she would be exiled beyond the borders of the province, erased from the record, her family's title revoked, her name made illegal within the principality's borders. But alive, but breathing, but free. The council gave him until the following morning. He spent the night in the royal library. He did not read. He stood at the shelf where the letters had lived, where her handwriting had existed, folded in the dark between the pages, waiting in the particular patience that had defined everything she ever gave him. His hand rested on the wood. The shelf was empty. Halid had been thorough. Outside the arched windows, the Loire moved in the dark, unhurried and indifferent, as it had moved for 1,000 years before this night and would move for 1,000 years after it. The principality did not stop for grief. The law did not pause for conscience. By morning, Alaric had reached the only conclusion the architecture of the situation permitted. He sent the note through the one channel Halid had not yet closed, the old kitchen passage that connected the library's east entrance to the servants' quarters, used by a single elderly footman who had known them both since childhood and who would, before the week was out, receive a reassignment notice to a property in the Anjou. The note said only, "The library. Before dawn. Say nothing." She was already there when he arrived. She stood at the far end of the room, near the window where the Loire light came in gray and cold and without comfort. She had not lit a candle. She was not weeping. She was composed in the manner that Alaric had always found simultaneously heartbreaking and magnificent. The composure not of a woman who did not feel things, but of a woman who had decided, with great deliberateness, that she would not allow this moment to become something undignified, that whatever the law was about to do to her name, it would not touch the way she conducted herself in this room, in this hour, in front of the only witness whose opinion of her had ever genuinely mattered. He walked to the center of the room. He stopped. She reached into her sleeve. The blue ribbon, 15 years old, faded along its central fold from years of being pressed against her wrist in the dark, was placed in his hand. Her fingers did not linger. The exchange was precise, deliberate, final. She turned. She walked to the door. She did not look back. This was not, as it might appear to a casual observer, an act of coldness. It was an act of extraordinary love. Perhaps the most complete expression of love that the entire 15 years of their acquaintance had produced. Because Amélie Voss de Chantrel understood, with the precision of a woman who had spent a decade and a half reading between the lines of a man the world insisted on misreading, that if she looked back, if she gave him one moment of her eyes, one fraction of the grief she was carrying with the same careful discipline she had always applied to everything that mattered, he would not walk to the signing chamber. And then they would take her to Mont Severin, and she would spend the rest of her life in a fortress above the river, watching the same lawyer that had witnessed every midnight walk, every hidden letter, every carefully managed glance across a candlelit salon, watching it from a window she could not open, in a room she could not leave. She would rather be erased. She would rather cease to exist in every record the principality had ever kept than have him spend the rest of his life knowing that his refusal to let her go had become her cage. The door closed. He stood alone in the library for a long time. The gray light moved across the floor. The river ran outside. The shelf where the letters had lived stood empty. Then he straightened his coat, clasped his hands behind his back, and walked to the signing chamber. The chamber was formal and fully attended. The 8 members of the High Council stood as witnesses. The Decree of Erasure lay spread flat on the central table. The parchment thick, the language precise, the blank line at the bottom waiting with the patience of a document that had been drafted 100 years before and had always expected, eventually, to be used. Alaric stood over it. The quill was placed in his hand. His hand was trembling. Not dramatically, not in the manner of theatrical grief, not enough for any man in the room to have grounds to comment upon it. A slight, barely perceptible tremor in the fingers of a man who had held his composure through everything the court had ever asked of him and was now discovering, at this particular table, the precise location of its limit. He put the quill to the parchment. His name began to form. The tear fell before the signature was complete. He had not intended it, had not, in some private act of self-discipline, decided to allow it. It simply happened, in the way that the body occasionally refuses the instructions of the mind at moments of sufficient extremity. It landed on the descending stroke of his final letter, the last character of the name he had been signing to documents since the age of 12, and spread the ink in a thin, dark bloom. A small imperfection in an otherwise clean document. Not enough to invalidate the signing. The document was legally complete. The tear was not a legal event, but it was a permanent one. The ink dried in that bloomed, irregular shape. Every copy that would be made of this document, every archival reproduction, every notarial certification, would carry that slight, spreading imperfection in the final stroke of the king's signature, like a scar in the record itself. The witnesses looked away, in the manner of men who understood that what they were witnessing was beyond their jurisdiction to acknowledge. Sebastian Halid, the Duke of Merac, noted it. His expression did not change. He said nothing. The seal was pressed. The decree of erasure was complete. The library, the letters, the midnight garden path behind the yew hedge, the blue ribbon. 15 years of a private world built in the margins of propriety with extraordinary patience and extraordinary care. All of it now, under the constitutional law of the Principality of Aurevalle, illegal to remember. Her name could not be spoken. Her face could not be displayed. Her family's title, the modest single-generation patent that had placed her 1 generation short of the law's requirement, was stripped from the Vicomte de Chantrel that same afternoon, by separate order, without ceremony. She ceased to exist. The law closed over the space she had occupied the way water closes over a stone, completely, immediately, without visible seam. And Alaric walked back to his throne. History is, at its core, a record of what institutions chose to preserve. The Annals de Vauclaire, the official chronicle of the Principality, maintained without interruption from 934 to the present, records the reign of King Alaric II in terms that are, by the standards of dynastic record-keeping, extraordinarily favorable. He is described, across multiple volumes and by multiple chroniclers writing in different decades, as one of the most effective sovereigns the Principality had ever produced. The evidence supports the assessment. In the first decade of his reign, Alaric reformed the Principality's inheritance codes, dismantling several of the most egregiously unjust provisions of the entail system that had, for 2 centuries, left noble widows and second sons economically destitute regardless of their families' actual holdings. The reform was not universally popular among the older noble families. He passed it regardless. He established the first public lending library in the Loire Valley, a building funded entirely from the royal household budget, staffed by scholars rather than courtiers, open to any resident of Aurevalle regardless of title or station. The institution operated for 200 years after his death. Several historians, noting the particular passion with which the king advocated for the project, have speculated about the personal significance it may have held for him. The Annals does not comment on this. He negotiated the Treaty of Vauclaire, a settlement of a border dispute with a neighboring territory that had, under the previous administration, been drifting steadily toward military confrontation. Without the loss of a single life, through 3 years of patient, methodical diplomacy that the participating envoys described in their own correspondence as unlike any royal negotiation they had previously encountered. The king, they noted, appeared to have an exceptional capacity for sitting quietly with difficult situations until their resolution became apparent. He married, as the decree required, a countess of impeccable lineage, 4 generations of verified peerage on both sides, not a procedural ambiguity anywhere in the documentation. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine grace. She managed the social architecture of the court with skill. She gave him 2 heirs. She deserved, by any fair measure, a husband who was entirely present. She had instead a king who was always, in some interior chamber of himself that she could sense but never locate, standing in a library at dawn, watching a door close on a woman the law had since decided had never existed. She did not speak of this. The court of Vauclaire had not survived 8 centuries by encouraging its inhabitants to speak of things that could not be changed. Decades passed. The Loire moved. The seasons came and returned. The candles in the throne room burned down and were replaced by new ones that burned down in their turn. In the private study of an elderly king, on a writing table cleared of the day's correspondence, sat a gilded box. It was not large. It was not particularly distinguished in its appearance. The gilt had dulled with years of handling. The hinge moved stiffly. It was the sort of object a court archivist would have catalogued as personal effects, miscellaneous, and thought nothing further of. He opened it. Inside, a blue silk ribbon, frayed at both ends where the weave had given way over decades of careful, repeated handling. The fold lines still visible. Permanent creases pressed into the fabric over 15 years of living in a sleeve, in a book's spine, in the closed hand of a woman crossing a darkened corridor. The color had changed. What had once been the vivid, particular blue of a summer afternoon, the blue of a childhood wager won on a point of Latin grammar, pressed into a small hand with a gravity that neither of them had fully understood at the time, had softened over 50 years into something quieter. The color of sky in the last moments before dark. The color of a thing that has been loved for so long it has become something other than what it started as. He lifted it from the box. And in the way that old men sometimes hold objects they are not quite prepared to look at directly, raising them close without looking, the way you might hold something warm in winter, He brought the ribbon near his face. The law had been extraordinarily thorough. It had struck her name from the civic record. It had revoked her family's title. It had relocated the servants and burned the letters and turned the portraits and made the speaking of her name a criminal act within the borders of the principality she had loved. But the law had not thought to erase the midnight garden. The ribbon still carried it. Faint, ghostly, preserved in silk with the irrational stubbornness of things that refused to accept the terms of their own erasure. The lavender that had grown along the path behind the yew hedge. The cold of a Loire winter night. The wet stone of the garden walk after rain. And underneath all of it, so faint it may have been memory rather than scent, imagination rather than evidence, the warmth of proximity. Of two people standing close enough that the world they were forbidden to occupy together became, for the length of a moment, entirely real. He sat with it for a long time. Outside, the Loire moved in the evening dark, unhurried and indifferent as it always had. This is the weight that the Annals de Vauclaire does not record. Not in the inheritance reforms, not in the treaty that preserved a generation of young men from a war they did not ask for, not in the lending library that stood for 2 centuries in the Loire Valley and gave 10,000 ordinary people access to the same books that had once been the private world of a prince and a vicomte's daughter. The chronicles record what a man accomplished. They do not record the cost of the accomplishment. They do not record the 10,000 ordinary mornings that followed the signing of the decree, each one requiring the same choice made again without ceremony, without witness, without the dignity even of being recognized as a choice at all. The simple, grinding, daily act of continuing to govern a principality with justice and intelligence and care, when the only evidence that you were still capable of warmth was a fraying ribbon in a gilded box that the law had forgotten to confiscate. Sacrifice, in the histories, is a single dramatic gesture, a signature, a sealed decree, a door closing in a gray dawn library. In the lived experience of the man who makes it, sacrifice is not a moment. It is every moment after. He was called the Cold King. He was the loneliest warm man who ever wore a crown. He saved the kingdom, but he lost his soul.